She agreed to surrogacy for a stranger, but a clinic mix-up meant carrying the reclusive billionaire's heir. What happened next changed everything. Hey Story Channel family, we know this one's going to be a roller coaster. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss how this incredible story unfolds. Give us a like if you're ready for the drama and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Today, okay, let's get into Sarah's story. The rhythmic, metronomic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound punctuating the sterile silence of room 304 at Chicago General. Sarah Jenkins sat hunched in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, her gaze fixed on the too-still form of her brother, Liam, lying in the hospital bed. Wires snaked from beneath the thin white blanket, connecting him to a constellation of machines that blinked and hummed with quiet diligence. At 19, Liam should have been worrying about college applications or weekend plans, not the terrifyingly low oxygen saturation levels displayed on the monitor beside him, cystic fibrosis. The diagnosis had landed like a bomb years ago, but now it was a relentless siege. His lungs, scarred and weary, fought for every breath. The doctors spoke in hushed, grave tones about limited options and the desperate need for a double lung transplant. A procedure with a waiting list as long as his odds felt short, and a price tag that seemed plucked from a different universe. $250,000 just to get on the high-priority list and cover initial costs, they'd said. $250,000. Sarah felt the number lodge itself in her throat, cold and suffocating. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Liam's pale hand. It felt cool to the touch. His eyes fluttered open briefly, a flicker of the vibrant boy she knew hidden beneath the exhaustion. "Hey, Sarah," he rasped, the effort visible. "Hey, you," she forced a bright smile, blinking back the sting of tears. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," he admitted, a small sigh escaping his lips. "Dreamed I was breathing underwater, but in a good way." Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "Just rest, okay? I'm handling things." Handling things. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Her job as a barista at a downtown coffee shop barely covered her own rent and bills, let alone the mountain of medical debt that grew taller each day. She plastered on another smile. "You just focus on getting stronger. I'll be back tomorrow." "Okay?" Liam managed a weak nod before his eyes drifted closed again. Sarah stayed a moment longer, watching the rise and fall of his chest, each breath a victory, each beep of the monitor a reminder of the race against time. As she walked out into the antiseptic-smelling hallway, the weight of the world settled heavily on her shoulders. How? How could she possibly find that kind of money? Later that night, back in her small, sparsely furnished apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, Sarah sat at her worn kitchen table. Overdue bills lay scattered before her like fallen soldiers. Rent notice stamped final, electricity threatening shut-off, the crushing hospital statements. She scrolled numbly through fundraising websites, online loan applications, all dead ends. Her savings were non-existent, her credit score wrecked by past medical emergencies. Hope felt like a distant memory. She buried her face in her hands, fighting back a sob of pure frustration and despair. It wasn't fair. Liam deserved a chance. He deserved to live, to breathe freely. As she lifted her head, wiping her eyes, a small, targeted ad flickered at the bottom of her laptop screen. It was discreet, almost clinical. Help make dreams come true. Generous compensation for qualified gestational carriers. Confidentiality assured. North Shore Fertility Institute. Sarah stared at it. Gestational carrier. Surrogacy. The idea hit her with the force of a physical blow, carrying someone else's child. It felt alien, invasive, almost violating. She recoiled instinctively. No, absolutely not. But then the image of Liam struggling for breath flashed in her mind. The stark reality of the bills on the table pressed in. Generous compensation. Enough for Liam? Enough to save him? A war raged within her. Her morals, her sense of self, recoiled from the thought of treating pregnancy, of life itself as a transaction. But the fierce, protective love for her brother whispered a desperate counter-argument. What wouldn't you do for him? The ad seemed to pulse on the screen, a beacon of dubious hope in her sea of despair. With trembling fingers, Ignoring the nausea churning in her stomach, Sarah clicked the link. A week later, Sarah found herself sitting in the hushed, opulent waiting room of the North Shore Fertility Institute. Everything about the place screamed wealth and exclusivity. Plush velvet armchairs, abstract art on the walls, the scent of expensive diffusers mingling with the sterile tang of medical facilities. She felt acutely out of place in her slightly worn jeans and blouse, clutching her purse tightly in her lap. Ms. Jenkins? A man in a perfectly tailored suit, with cool grey eyes and an air of professional detachment, approached her. Mr. Thorne, please come this way. He led her to a private consultation room, all polished wood and soft lighting. Mr. Thorne explained the process with brisk efficiency. The intended parents were a wealthy private couple who wished to remain completely anonymous. All communication would go through the clinic and their legal team. Strict confidentiality was paramount. He slid a thick contract across the table. This outlines the terms, he stated. Full medical care provided, all related expenses covered, and a tiered compensation structure. He pointed to the figures. A significant sum upon signing and successful embryo transfer. Another substantial payment upon confirmation of a viable heartbeat. And the final largest sum, totaling $150,000, upon the birth of the child and the relinquishment of all parental rights, $150,000. Enough for Liam's transplant evaluation, the initial costs, and maybe, just maybe, a tiny buffer for recovery. Sarah scanned the clauses, the legal jargon blurring before her eyes. Relinquishment of all parental rights, no contact post-birth, strict confidentiality. It felt cold, brutal, a transaction for a life. Do you have any questions, Ms. Jenkins? Mr. Thorne asked, his tone polite but impatient. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. She thought of Liam, of his labored breathing, of the astronomical bills. This was his only chance. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. No questions, Mr. Thorne nodded curtly, placing a pen on top of the contract. Sign here and here. Her hand shook as she picked up the pen. The ink flowed onto the paper, sealing her fate, sealing Liam's potential future. It felt like signing away a part of her soul. As soon as the contract was signed and witnessed, Mr. Thorne arranged for the initial payment transfer. Later that day, staring at the balance in her meager bank account suddenly boosted by an unimaginable sum, Sarah felt a dizzying mix of relief and profound dread. She immediately called the hospital transplant coordinator, her voice trembling. As she confirmed she could cover the initial fees for Liam, she had bought him time, but the cost felt impossibly high. Sarah's next visits to the clinic were a blur of medical exams, injections, and impersonal procedures. She felt more like a vessel than a person, a necessary component in someone else's meticulously planned dream. The staff were professional but distant, adhering to the strict anonymity protocols. One crisp afternoon, as Sarah was leaving after a blood draw, a sleek black town car pulled up to the clinic's private entrance. The back door opened, and a tall man emerged, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his face partially obscured by sunglasses, though the sharp line of his jaw and the aura of intense, coiled energy were unmistakable. He moved with purpose, flanked by a poised older woman carrying a briefcase, likely an assistant. Sarah caught only a glimpse as they were quickly ushered inside through a separate entrance, the staff snapping to attention with a deference she hadn't experienced. She didn't think much of it, just another obscenely wealthy client in a clinic built for them. Inside, in a different wing, Alexander Vance sat stiffly in a private consultation room. His assistant, Ms. Evelyn Albright, handled the conversation with the clinic director. Years ago, before the accident that took his wife, Amelia, they had undergone IVF, cryopreserving several embryos. Now, years later, Alexander had finally decided to close that painful chapter. He was signing the final consent forms to have the remaining embryos respectfully destroyed. It felt like severing the last tangible link to the future they'd planned together. He signed the documents with a hand that didn't tremble, but his eyes were distant, shadowed by a grief that time hadn't healed. Ms. Albright collected the paperwork, her expression sympathetic but professional. "Everything is taken care of, Mr. Vance," she murmured. He simply nodded, eager to leave the place filled with ghosts of what might have been. Deep within the clinic's state-of-the-art laboratory, later that same week, the atmosphere was busy. Technicians in white coats moved between workstations, handling delicate equipment. One technician, looking slightly frazzled after a double shift, was preparing samples for upcoming procedures. Two small identically labeled cryovials stood side by side in the nitrogen vapor, one containing the embryo designated for the anonymous Surrogacy, Sarah's procedure, the other containing an embryo from the Vance collection, recently moved, from long-term storage pending the final destruction order, perhaps for one last viability check required by protocol before disposal. His phone buzzed sharply on the bench beside him. He glanced down, distracted for just a second, his hand momentarily hovering over the vials before moving one into the transfer container. A fleeting moment, an insignificant interruption. Or was it? The embryo transfer procedure was clinical and brief. Sarah lay on the table, staring at the ceiling, feeling detached, reminding herself this was for Liam. Weeks later, the call came. "Ms. Jenkins, Dr. Peterson's office. Congratulations, the pregnancy test is positive." Sarah sank onto her couch, the phone still pressed to her ear. Pregnant. It was real. Relief washed over her. The next payment installment would be released. Liam's treatment could continue uninterrupted. But beneath the relief was a strange, unsettling flutter. A life was growing inside her, a life conceived in a contract, destined for strangers. The first trimester was a lonely, exhausting haze. Morning sickness hit her hard, making her barista job almost unbearable. She kept her secret carefully guarded, offering vague excuses to friends and colleagues. She sent regular updates to Liam, focusing only on his improving health, shielding him from her own struggles. Nights were the hardest, alone in her small apartment, feeling the profound changes in her body, the weight of her secret, and the ache of missing Liam. Then, one quiet evening, curled up on her couch, she felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible, flutter deep within her abdomen, like a butterfly's wing. She held her breath, pressing a hand against her belly. It happened again. A small flicker of movement. Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes, unbidden and confusing. This wasn't supposed to be emotional. This was a contract, a means to an end. But feeling that tiny spark of life, her body nurturing it, ignited an instinct, a connection she hadn't anticipated and certainly hadn't wanted. She was carrying a child. And despite everything, a fierce, protective wave washed over her, complicated and terrifying. The path ahead suddenly felt even more fraught than she had imagined. Several months had passed since Sarah signed the contract that felt like a lifeline and a prison sentence rolled into one. The initial substantial payment had secured Liam's spot for the transplant evaluation and covered the first phase of his intensive preoperative care. Seeing the relief, however fragile in her brother's eyes, was the anchor Sarah clung to whenever the weight of her secret threatened to pull her under. Her life settled into a strange, bifurcated rhythm. By day, she forced smiles serving coffee. To rushed commuters, the scent of espresso clinging to her clothes, a stark contrast to the clinical anonymity of her weekly visits to the North Shore Fertility Institute. By night, exhaustion warred with anxiety. The nausea had subsided, replaced by the undeniable swell of her belly and the increasingly frequent, fluttering kicks from within, tiny reminders of the life she nurtured but could not claim. She meticulously documented her health for the clinic coordinator, answered impersonal emails, and tried desperately not to think about the faceless, nameless couple whose dream she was carrying. Liam was stable, holding steady on the transplant list, and that had to be enough. Meanwhile, miles away in a steel and glass penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Alexander Vance moved through his meticulously ordered world. His days were a fortress built of board meetings, strategic acquisitions, and ruthless negotiations. His technology empire, built from the ground up after dropping out of Stanford, thrived on his relentless drive and laser focus. His home, a minimalist expanse of polished chrome, dark wood, and vast windows, reflected the man himself. Impressive, powerful, and devoid of warmth. The only personal touch was a single silver-framed photograph on his massive desk. A woman with laughing eyes and windswept hair, Amelia, his late wife. Gone 3 years now, claimed by a sudden, brutal illness that had ripped the future they'd envisioned to shreds. He hadn't planned on revisiting the subject of children. The embryos they had frozen, symbols of a shared hope, had become painful relics. The recent decision to authorize their destruction felt like closing a final, agonizing chapter. He had signed the papers at the clinic, filed the memory away in the vault where he kept his grief, and returned to the predictable certainty of his work, until the secure, encrypted communication arrived. It wasn't from his usual legal team. It came directly from the highest echelons of the North Shore Fertility Institute's administration, marked urgent and confidential. Ms. Albright, his ever-efficient executive assistant, brought the tablet into his office, her usual composure tinged with a rare hint of concern. "Mr. Vance, this requires your immediate attention. It concerns the disposition authorization you signed last month." Alexander frowned, taking the tablet. He expected a bureaucratic follow-up, a final confirmation. Instead, the message detailed, "In careful legalese-laden paragraphs, an unprecedented procedural error. A catastrophic human mistake within their state-of-the-art laboratory. Cross-contamination protocols breached. Sample misidentification." The clinical terms danced before his eyes, meaningless until the final, horrifying sentence crystallized, regrettably resulted in the unintended utilization of an embryo derived from client Vance's genetic material in an unrelated, anonymous gestational surrogacy procedure. The tablet nearly slipped from his grasp. He reread the sentence, then again, the blood draining from his face, replaced by a surge of ice-cold fury. An embryo. His embryo. Amelia's embryo. Used in a stranger. Get Thorne from Halstead Legal on the line. "Now," he commanded, his voice dangerously quiet. Ms. Albright, sensing the seismic shift, moved swiftly. The conversation with his lawyer was clipped, brutal. Alexander demanded answers. Accountability. Consequences. How could this happen? Who was responsible? And most crucially, who was the woman? The clinic, facing the wrath of Alexander Vance and the threat of a lawsuit that could decimate their reputation, scrambled. Within hours, leveraging legal pressure that bent confidentiality clauses to their breaking point, Alexander had the information. A name, Sarah Jenkins. An address on the far south side. A file containing basic medical clearance data and a grainy ID photo showing a young woman with tired but strikingly clear blue eyes. He stared at the photo, a maelstrom of conflicting emotions churning beneath his icy exterior. Fury at the violation, a strange, unwelcome flicker of something else. A child. His child. A biological continuation he hadn't sought, hadn't wanted, forced upon him, yet undeniably linked to him, to Amelia. This wasn't a business problem to be solved with money or legal threats. This was chaos, an intrusion of messy, unpredictable life into his fortress of control. "Prepare the car, Evelyn," he said, his voice tight. "I need to see this woman myself." Sarah had just finished a long shift, the smell of stale coffee clinging to her uniform, her feet aching. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her walk-up apartment, the familiar scent of dust and aging building materials greeting her. She longed for a hot shower and sleep, but first she had to check her messages for any updates on Liam. Sharp, authoritative knock echoed through her thin apartment door, startling her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, she peered through the peephole. A tall man in an expensive suit stood there, his face set in harsh lines, partially obscured by the dim hallway light, but radiating an intimidating aura. Beside him stood an older, severe-looking woman. Sarah's heart began to pound. Debt collectors, landlord issues? She opened the door a crack, leaving the chain latched. "Can I help you?" The man's gaze swept over her, sharp and assessing, taking in her worn clothes and the fatigue etched onto her face. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a chilling intensity. "Sarah Jenkins?" he asked, his voice deep and clipped. Yes? Who are you?" My name is Alexander Vance. He paused, letting the name hang in the air, though it meant nothing to Sarah. We need to talk about the arrangement you made with the North Shore Fertility Institute. Sarah's blood ran cold. The clinic? How did this man know? Was something wrong? I don't understand. That's supposed to be anonymous. A humorless smirk touched Alexander's lips. Anonymity has its limits when catastrophic errors are made. An error involving me. He gestured impatiently. Let us in. This conversation is not for the hallway. Hesitantly, feeling a growing sense of dread, Sarah fumbled with the chain and opened the door wider. Alexander Vance and Ms. Albright stepped inside, their expensive shoes silent on her threadbare rug. The sheer contrast between their polished presence and her humble apartment was jarring. They seemed to suck the very air out of the small room. Ms. Jenkins, Alexander began, dispensing with any pretense of pleasantry. I've been informed by the clinic of a severe procedural breach. It appears the embryo transferred to you was not sourced from the intended anonymous party. Sarah stared at him, confused. What are you saying? Alexander's eyes narrowed, his voice devoid of emotion. I'm saying the child you are carrying is biologically mine. The words hit Sarah like a physical force. She staggered back, gripping the edge of her small kitchen counter for support. Yours? She whispered, disbelief warring with dawning horror. But the couple, the contract, Alexander interrupted coldly, is predicated on a fundamental error by the clinic. It involves my genetic material, Ms. Jenkins. Material I explicitly authorized for destruction. You are carrying my child, conceived under false pretenses facilitated by the clinic's negligence. Sarah's mind reeled. His child, not the anonymous couple's. This powerful, imposing, cold stranger was the father. Everything shifted, the ground beneath her feet turning to quicksand. The contract, the money, Liam's treatment. What did this mean? I didn't know, she stammered, tears welling in her eyes. They told me it was anonymous. Their incompetence is irrelevant to the current reality, Alexander stated flatly. He glanced around the small, clean, but clearly struggling apartment with unconcealed distaste. It's also clear that your current circumstances are less than ideal for the gestation of my heir. Heir. The word landed like a stone. He wasn't thinking about a baby, a person. He was thinking about lineage, legacy. Therefore, he continued, his tone leaving no room for argument, new arrangements must be made. You will cease your employment immediately. You will relocate to accommodations I provide, where your health and the child's development can be properly monitored under my supervision. All expenses will naturally be covered. Ms. Albright will handle the details. Sarah felt a surge of defiance rise through the shock. Wait, you can't just take over my life. I have a brother who depends on me. I signed a contract. A contract rendered potentially void by the clinic's error, Alexander cut her off smoothly. And your brother's situation, he added, his gaze flicking towards a framed photo of a smiling Liam on a small shelf, indicating Ms. Albright had already briefed him, is precisely why you will comply. Continued financial support for his care is, of course, contingent upon your full cooperation under the new circumstances. It was a checkmate delivered with chilling precision. He knew her weakness, her motivation. He was offering security, the best possible care for the baby, and continued support for Liam, but at the cost of her autonomy, trapping her in a gilded cage of his making. She was no longer a party in a contract. She was a vessel under his direct control. Tears of anger and helplessness streamed down her face. She had traded one form of desperation for another, orchestrated by a man who saw her, and the life growing inside her as little more than a complication to be managed. The move was swift and impersonal. Within days, Sarah found herself installed in a minimalist high-tech guest suite within one of Alexander Vance's secondary properties, a sprawling modern house nestled in a wealthy suburban enclave far from her old neighborhood. It wasn't his main residence, Ms. Albright had explained coolly, but it offered privacy, security and easy access for the top-tier medical team Alexander had immediately engaged. The suite was luxurious beyond anything Sarah had ever imagined. Fine linens, a spa-like bathroom, a kitchenette stocked with organic foods chosen by a nutritionist. Yet it felt sterile, impersonal. There were security personnel discreetly posted, and Ms. Albright managed her schedule with quiet efficiency. Doctor's appointments, meal deliveries, prenatal vitamins laid out precisely. Sarah had everything she materially needed, but she had lost her freedom. Her barista job was a distant memory. Contact with the outside world felt filtered, managed. She spoke to Liam daily via video call, forcing cheerfulness, assuring him she was fine. Working remotely on a special project. The lie tasted bitter. Alexander Vance remained a ghost. He didn't visit the property himself in those first few weeks. Updates were relayed through Ms. Albright. Medical reports landed on his desk, meticulously reviewed. He had contained the situation, compartmentalized it. Sarah Jenkins was a problem, an unexpected variable, but one he was managing with the same detached efficiency he applied to a corporate merger. Yet, sometimes late at night in his silent penthouse, staring at Amelia's photograph, he would feel an unwelcome flicker of something else. Disquiet. The thought of a child, his child, their child, growing in a stranger, the result of a grotesque error, gnawed at the edges of his control. Sarah, meanwhile, felt the baby grow stronger, the kicks becoming more insistent. Alone, in the luxurious silence, she would talk to the bump, whispering stories about Liam, about her dreams of being a designer, about the world outside the pristine walls. She started sketching again, filling pages of a notebook Ms. Albright had provided upon request, sketches of cityscapes, of Liam smiling, of abstract patterns born from her swirling emotions. It was her small act of rebellion, a way to hold on to herself. One afternoon, Ms. Albright entered the suite carrying a small, elegantly wrapped package. "Mr. Vance asked me to give this to you," she said, her expression neutral. Inside, Sarah found a high-end tablet preloaded with professional design software and a subscription to online art courses. There was no note. Sarah stared at it, bewildered. Was this another form of control? Or something else? A calculated gesture to keep her occupied? Or could it be a sliver of acknowledgement, however impersonal, of the person carrying his child? The ambiguity was just another layer of her strange, unsettling new reality. She didn't know what to think, except that the silence from Alexander Vance himself was becoming increasingly loud. Then, one evening, Ms. Albright discreetly informed Alexander about the reason behind Sarah's initial surrogacy agreement, the desperate need for funds for her brother's lung transplant. She laid out the medical report she'd obtained, the dire prognosis, the astronomical costs. Alexander listened in silence, his face unreadable. His first instinct was cold calculation, so she was desperate. This explains her compliance. But as Albright detailed Liam's condition, the specific genetic markers of the disease, a different, unwelcome thought surfaced. It wasn't pity, it was resonance, a reminder of the helplessness he'd felt watching Amelia fade, despite all his wealth. He dismissed the feeling irritably. Ensure the clinic's initial compensation payments are being properly allocated to his medical trust, Evelyn. That was part of their obligation for the error. Monitor his progress. It's prudent to ensure the gestational carrier remains free from undue stress. He framed it as practicality, as protecting his asset. But as Miss Albright nodded and left, Alexander found himself staring at Amelia's photo again, the polished surface reflecting a man more conflicted than he cared to admit. The neat lines of his controlled world were beginning to blur. Life in the suburban mansion settled into a strange monotony for Sarah. Days were measured by medical appointments, prenatal yoga sessions conducted via video call, and the quiet hours spent sketching, or taking online design courses on the tablet Alexander had provided. The luxury was undeniable. Gourmet meals appeared as if by magic, the bed felt like sinking into a cloud, and the silence was broken only by the gentle hum of the air conditioning or the distant sound of gardeners maintaining the pristine grounds. Yet it was a profoundly lonely existence. Miss Albright remained her primary point of contact, always professional, polite, but offering no real companionship. Sarah missed the easy camaraderie of the coffee shop, the casual interactions with strangers, the simple freedom of walking down a city street unnoticed. Most of all, she ached for Liam, confined to video calls where she had to carefully curate her words, painting a picture of a demanding but rewarding remote project, hiding the bizarre reality of her situation. She poured her anxieties and burgeoning maternal feelings into her sketchbook, pages filled with abstract swirls of confusion and hope, detailed studies of the way sunlight fell across the perfectly manicured lawn, and increasingly tentative sketches of tiny hands and feet. The baby inside her was a constant presence now, kicks and rolls becoming stronger, more defined. She found herself talking to the bump more often, her voice soft in the quiet rooms, sharing her fears about Liam, her frustration with Alexander's detached control, and her confusing mix of resentment and a dawning unwanted connection to the life she carried. Alexander, meanwhile, kept his distance physically, but found himself increasingly preoccupied. He received daily updates from Ms. Albright and weekly summaries from the medical team. He reviewed Sarah's health metrics with the same analytical focus he applied to stock market reports. Everything was proceeding optimally, as the doctors put it. The asset was developing perfectly, yet the clinical detachment he cultivated was becoming harder to maintain. He started requesting the security footage from the guest suite's common areas, not the private bedroom or bathroom. He wasn't a voyeur, he told himself, but the living area, the small patio. He justified it as security, ensuring her well-being. But he found himself watching Sarah as she sketched, her brow furrowed in concentration, or as she paced, one hand resting protectively on her growing belly. He saw the moments of quiet sadness that crossed her face when she thought no one was looking, especially after her calls with Liam. He noted her resilience, her quiet dignity, despite the bizarre circumstances. She wasn't behaving like someone merely fulfilling a contract. She seemed engaged, invested. It was illogical. It was inconvenient, and it was undeniably intriguing. He learned more about Liam's condition through Ms. Albright's updates. The boy was holding steady, responding well to the initial phase of treatment funded by the clinic's settlement payment. A sum Alexander's lawyers had ensured was substantial after the error. Alexander authorized additional anonymous funds, routed through a foundation to cover supplementary therapies, framing it to Ms. Albright as mitigating potential stresses on the primary subject. He refused to examine the deeper impulse behind the gesture. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Ms. Albright entered his penthouse office. "Mr. Vance, there's a matter concerning Ms. Jenkins." Alexander looked up sharply. "Is she unwell?" "No, sir. Physically, she's fine. But Dr. Evans noted elevated stress levels during her checkup this morning. She seemed withdrawn. When pressed, she admitted to significant anxiety regarding her brother's upcoming evaluation for the active transplant list." Alexander frowned. "The funds are secure. His treatment is proceeding." "Yes, sir, but it appears the emotional toll is significant." Dr. Evans suggested minimizing external stresses. Ms. Albright paused, then added carefully, "Perhaps a brief in-person visit from her brother under controlled circumstances might be beneficial." Alexander's first instinct was to refuse. Complications, security risks, emotional entanglements. But the image of Sarah's sad face on the security feed flickered in his mind. And the memory, unwelcome but persistent, of sitting beside Amelia's hospital bed, feeling the crushing weight of helplessness. He hated that feeling. "Arrange it," he said curtly. "Strict protocols, limited duration, medical supervision on site during the visit." When Ms. Albright informed Sarah that Liam would be allowed a short visit, Sarah burst into tears, tears of pure, unadulterated relief. The thought of seeing him, hugging him, felt like sunshine breaking through a storm. The visit was carefully orchestrated. Liam, looking frail but with brighter eyes than Sarah had seen in months, was brought to the house by a medical transport service. They met in the sunroom, a bright space overlooking the gardens, with Ms. Albright and a discreet nurse present nearby. "Wow, Sarah, this remote project has some serious perks," Liam joked weakly, looking around the room. Sarah hugged him fiercely, fighting back tears. "It's temporary," she managed, forcing a smile. How are you feeling? Really? They talked. For the permitted hour, Liam sharing updates on his treatment, Sarah asking careful questions, trying to gauge his spirits. He noticed her belly, of course. Didn't know the project included that, he teased gently. Sarah's heart clenched. It's complicated, Liam. Part of the arrangement. I'll explain everything when the time is right. She hated the deception, but the relief of seeing him, hearing his voice in person, overshadowed the guilt just for a little while. Unbeknownst to them, Alexander watched the reunion via a security feed in his office. He saw Sarah's forced smiles, the genuine love radiating between the siblings, the underlying tension of her guarded answers. He saw Liam's fragility, his youthful bravery. And he felt that unwelcome pang again, not pity, but a sharp, uncomfortable recognition of shared human vulnerability. He abruptly switched off the feed. After Liam left, Sarah felt drained but lighter. The visit had been a lifeline. Later that evening, she was sketching on the patio when Alexander appeared unexpectedly. It was the first time he had come to the property since moving her here. He stood at a distance, hands in the pockets of his tailored trousers, observing her. Ms. Albright informed me the visit went well, he stated, his tone neutral. Sarah looked up, surprised by his presence. Yes, thank you, Mr. Vance. It meant a lot. He nodded curtly, his gaze drifting towards her sketchbook. Design software wasn't sufficient. Sarah felt herself flush slightly. Sometimes pencil and paper feel more real. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. May I? He indicated the sketchbook. Hesitantly, Sarah nodded. He picked it up, his long fingers carefully turning the pages. He paused at a detailed sketch of Liam smiling, then lingered on a series of abstract drawings filled with turbulent lines and contrasting shades. He didn't comment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he closed the book and handed it back. You have talent, he remarked, the observation stated as fact rather than compliment. Thank you, Sarah murmured, unnerved by his scrutiny. He looked out at the darkening garden. Ms. Albright mentioned your interest in design. Yes. I studied it for a couple of years before I had to stop. Perhaps, Alexander said, still not looking at her. When this arrangement concludes, my company's foundation could offer a scholarship for you to complete your studies. Sarah stared at him, stunned. A scholarship? Was this another calculated move? A way to ensure her silence and cooperation after the birth? Or was it something else? Why would you do that? She asked, suspicion lacing her voice. Alexander finally met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, she saw something flicker behind the usual impassivity. Weariness, perhaps. Consider it part of the comprehensive compensation package for the clinic's egregious error, he said smoothly, reverting to business terms. He turned to leave. Continue to focus on your health, Ms. Jenkins. That remains the priority. He walked away, leaving Sarah bewildered and more confused than ever. The offer felt both generous and manipulative, a kindness wrapped in the cold logic of a transaction. Yet, the brief glimpse of vulnerability she thought she'd seen, combined with the unexpected offer, chipped away another tiny piece of the wall she kept around her heart. Alexander Vance was an enigma, a puzzle she couldn't solve, and she was inextricably bound to him, carrying his child, living under his control, yet sensing currents shifting beneath the surface that neither of them seemed prepared for. The months stretched ahead, filled with the quiet growth of the baby and the unsettling evolution of the man who was its father. The second trimester brought a sense of physical equilibrium for Sarah, the draining nausea replaced by a burgeoning energy and the undeniable reality of her expanding figure. The mansion, once feeling like an opulent prison, started to feel familiar, if not exactly home. The quiet routines, the attentive if distant care provided by Ms. Albright and the staff, the long hours dedicated to her online design courses and sketching, they formed the structure of her days. Liam's health remained stable, a constant source of relief that anchored her through the strangeness of her circumstances. Her interactions with Alexander Vance remained infrequent, but subtly changed in tone after his unexpected scholarship offer. He didn't visit the suburban house again for several weeks, managing everything remotely through Ms. Albright. Yet, small, almost imperceptible signs of his attention continued. A rare orchid appeared in her suite one morning, with no note. Selection of specialized art history books were delivered, aligning perfectly with a course module she was studying. Sarah found herself analyzing these gestures, searching for intent. Were they calculated attempts to ensure her compliance, acknowledgements of her personhood beyond the contract, or simply the detached actions of a billionaire ensuring the environment for his investment was optimal? The uncertainty was maddening. He began requesting brief formal video calls once a week, ostensibly for medical updates, though Ms. Albright always provided those separately. During these calls, Alexander maintained a professional distance, inquiring about her health, the baby's development according to the latest reports, and occasionally, with a stilted air, about her studies. "The instructors report satisfactory progress," he stated during one call, his eyes scanning a report on his screen. "I'm enjoying it," Sarah replied honestly. "It's good to feel like I'm learning again, working towards something." A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. "Focus remains paramount on maintaining optimal health for the duration." "I know," Sarah said, a touch of defiance creeping into her voice. "But I'm still a person, Mr. Vance, not just an incubator." He didn't react immediately, his gaze holding hers through the screen for a long moment. "Your well-being is intrinsically linked to the primary objective, Ms. Jenkins," he responded finally, the deflection smooth but noticeable. Yet, after that call, a state-of-the-art ergonomic chair appeared in her study area. Sarah found herself increasingly drawn into the enigma of Alexander Vance. Ms. Albright, during her daily check-ins, occasionally let slip small curated details. His demanding schedule, his philanthropic work through the Vance Foundation, the same one he'd vaguely mentioned for the scholarship, his reputation in the tech world, as brilliant but ruthless and intensely private since Amelia's death. It painted a picture of a man who operated entirely on logic and control, yet who was capable of anonymous generosity and who clearly harbored deep, unexpressed grief. The baby, or babies as she would soon learn, became more active, strong kicks and persistent nudges punctuating her days and nights. Sarah would lie awake, one hand on her belly, feeling the vibrant life within. The connection deepened, becoming a fierce, almost primal bond that terrified her. How could she possibly walk away? The $150,000, once seeming like a fortune that could solve everything, now felt like blood money, a price tag on an impossible sacrifice. She pushed the thoughts away, focusing on Liam, reminding herself why she had made this choice. But the internal conflict gnawed at her constantly. The appointment for the detailed mid-pregnancy ultrasound arrived. Sarah felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. This felt different, more significant than the routine checkups. This was when they could see the baby clearly, check for abnormalities, perhaps even determine the sex. Ms. Albright informed her that Mr. Vance would be accompanying her. Sarah was surprised. He hadn't attended an appointment since the very first confirmation scan months ago. When his town car arrived to pick her up, he was already inside, staring out the window, his profile rigid. The silence in the car was thick with unspoken tension. "Are you feeling well?" he asked eventually, his voice formal. "Yes, a little nervous, I guess," Sarah admitted. He gave a curt nod, offering no words of reassurance, yet his presence beside her felt strangely grounding. He seemed tense too, his usual iron control betraying a subtle crack around the edges. At the clinic, a different, even more exclusive facility this time, they were ushered immediately into a private suite. The obstetrician, Dr. Lena Hansen, was warm but professional, clearly briefed on the high-profile, confidential nature of the situation. "All right, Sarah, let's take a look," Dr. Hansen said kindly, dimming the lights as Sarah lay back on the examination table. Alexander stood near the head of the table, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed intently on the large monitor. The cool gel spread across Sarah's belly, followed by the gentle pressure of the transducer. An image flickered onto the screen, swirls of grey and white indistinct at first. Then Dr. Hansen adjusted the angle, and a tiny, perfect profile came into view. A collective intake of breath seemed to hang in the air. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Everything looks excellent," Dr. Hansen murmured, moving the transducer slowly. "Strong heartbeat. Good growth. Measurements are right on track." She paused, zooming in. "And—" "Wait a moment." Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. "Is something wrong?" Dr. Hansen chuckled softly. "No, nothing wrong at all, just double the surprise." She adjusted the image again, pointing. "There's heartbeat number 1, and right here," she moved the transducer slightly, "is heartbeat number 2. Congratulations, Ms. Jenkins, Mr. Vance, you're expecting twins." Twins. The word echoed in the quiet room. Sarah stared at the screen where 2 tiny forms, 2 distinct heartbeats pulsed with life. 2 babies. Her mind struggled to comprehend it. A wave of overwhelming emotion washed over her. Shock, joy, terror, and a fierce, doubled sense of connection. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks now. She risked a glance at Alexander. He was completely still, his knuckles white where his arms were crossed. His face, usually an impenetrable mask, was pale, his eyes wide with undisguised shock. The control had shattered. He looked utterly poleaxed. 2? His voice was barely a whisper, rough and incredulous. "Yes, Mr. Vance." 2, Dr. Hansen confirmed, smiling. "Fraternal twins, it appears, both developing beautifully." Alexander didn't speak again. He just stared at the monitor, at the 2 separate lives flickering on the screen. Sarah watched him, seeing the carefully constructed walls around him visibly crumble. This wasn't part of his plan. This wasn't calculated or controlled. This was biology, chance, fate, throwing an entirely unforeseen variable into his meticulously managed world. 2 heirs, 2 connections to the past he thought he was burying, 2 lives depending on him and on her. The drive back to the mansion was unlike any before. The silence wasn't cold or awkward. It was charged, thick with the weight of the revelation. Sarah kept stealing glances at Alexander. He sat rigidly, staring straight ahead, but his jaw was clenched, and she could see the turmoil in the slight furrow of his brow. He seemed lost in a place she couldn't reach. As the car pulled up to the house, he finally turned to her. His voice was low, strained. "This changes parameters." Sarah met his gaze, her own emotions still raw. "It changes everything, Alexander." It was the first time she had used his first name. He didn't correct her. He nodded slowly, the single movement conveying a world of complex, unarticulated thought. "Yes," he conceded, his voice barely audible. "It changes everything." He got out of the car and walked into the mansion without waiting for her, leaving Sarah sitting there, one hand resting protectively over her belly, feeling the 2 tiny heartbeats within, wondering what future awaited them all in the face of this unexpected miracle or complication. The contract felt suddenly flimsy, inadequate for the profound reality unfolding between them. That night, sleep eluded Sarah. The revelation of twins had sent her emotions into overdrive. The protective instinct she felt had doubled, intensifying the terrifying question of how she could ever leave them. She paced the luxurious suite, the silence amplifying her anxieties. What would Alexander do? Would he try to alter the contract? Would he become even more controlling now that 2 heirs were involved? She found herself on the terrace, gazing out at the vast, indifferent darkness. A cool breeze rustled the leaves. In the garden below, she heard soft footsteps behind her and turned to see Alexander standing there silhouetted against the faint light spilling from the house. He wasn't wearing his usual suit jacket, just a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up slightly at the cuffs. He looked less like a billionaire mogul and more like a man grappling with something immense. He walked over to stand beside her at the railing, not speaking immediately, just looking out at the distant city lights. The shared silence felt different now, less like a void and more like a space filled with unspoken understanding. "I couldn't sleep," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Me neither," Sarah admitted. "It's a lot to take in." He nodded, running a hand through his dark hair, a rare gesture of disquiet. "My lawyers contacted the clinic this afternoon. The director offered profound apologies, Significant further compensation. Scapegoats will be found, procedures revised. He waved a dismissive hand. Irrelevant. He turned to face her, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. This wasn't planned, Sarah. None of it. My involvement. The number. I know, she whispered. My wife, Amelia, he began, his voice catching slightly. We wanted a family, more than anything. We went through IVF years ago before she got sick. These embryos, they were our last hope. When she died, he paused, swallowing hard. I decided to let go of that future. It was too painful. Authorizing their destruction was supposed to be closure. He looked away, towards the darkness. And now this. It feels like fate playing a cruel joke, or a second chance. Sarah finished softly, surprising herself. Alexander looked back at her, startled. He seemed to consider her words, a complex mix of emotions flickering across his face. Pain, confusion, maybe a glimmer of something else. I don't believe in second chances, he stated, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Maybe you didn't have to, Sarah said gently. Maybe sometimes they find you anyway. He stared at her, the intensity of his gaze making her breath catch. He saw her not just as the vessel for his children, but as the woman standing beside him, sharing this overwhelming, unexpected twist of fate. He saw the strength beneath her vulnerability, the quiet resilience that had allowed her to navigate this impossible situation. The contract, he started, then stopped. The original agreement seems inadequate. Sarah's heart pounded. What are you saying, Alexander? He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking. I'm saying... I don't know what I'm saying, except that this changes things. For both of us, for them. He gestured vaguely towards her belly. We need to figure this out. Together. The word hung in the air. Together. It was tentative, uncertain, fraught with complications, but it was there. A shift had occurred. The discovery of twins hadn't just doubled the stakes, it had irrevocably intertwined their futures in a way neither could have predicted, forcing them to confront the possibility of something beyond the cold print of a contract. The storm clouds that had gathered earlier seemed to part slightly, revealing a sliver of moon, casting a pale, uncertain light on the path ahead. The final weeks of the pregnancy were a strange blend of quiet anticipation and unspoken tension. The discovery of twins had undeniably shifted the ground beneath Sarah and Alexander. While he never explicitly retracted the original premise of their arrangement, his actions spoke volumes. He ensured Sarah had round-the-clock access to the best neonatal specialists' personally reviewed nursery plans, now doubled, and his weekly video calls became daily, brief check-ins, his questions evolving from purely medical inquiries to tentative queries about how she was feeling. He began spending more evenings at the suburban house, not always interacting directly with Sarah, but simply being present. He'd work quietly in the study adjacent to the main living area where Sarah sketched or read, the shared silence punctuated only by the turning of pages or the clicking of his keyboard. It was a subtle but significant change. He was no longer managing the situation from afar. He was inhabiting it. Sarah found herself observing him during these quiet evenings. She saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the way he sometimes paused, staring into the distance, lost in thoughts he never shared. She saw him research high-risk twin pregnancies on his tablet, his brow furrowed with concentration that seemed more personal than pragmatic. He remained intensely private, emotionally guarded, but the rigid control was fraying, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the billionaire armor. Her own feelings were a tangled mess. The connection to the two lives growing inside her was fierce, undeniable. The thought of leaving them was a physical ache, a constant dread simmering beneath the surface. Yet her feelings for Alexander were equally confusing. Gratitude was mixed with resentment, fascination with fear. She saw his efforts, his softening demeanor, the moments of unexpected kindness. But the shadow of the contract, the cold transaction that had brought them together, loomed large. Could she truly trust this change? Was it driven by genuine emotion, or simply by the unexpected reality of 2 heirs instead of 1. Liam thankfully continued to improve. His doctors were optimistic about his place on the transplant list, and the secure funding had eased a significant burden. During their calls, Sarah focused on his progress, carefully avoiding the full truth of her own complex situation. The guilt of the omission ate at her, but she couldn't risk adding her bizarre reality to his already heavy load. One cool evening, just shy of her 37th week, Sarah felt the first sharp, insistent pang low in her abdomen. She tried to breathe through it, telling herself it was just another Braxton Hicks contraction, stronger than usual. But then another came, tighter, more demanding, and another. She knew, with a sudden jolt of panic and clarity, that this was it. She alerted Ms. Albright via the intercom system in her suite. Within minutes, the calm efficiency Sarah had come to expect clicked into high gear. Ms. Albright appeared, her face composed, but her eyes sharp with focus. "Dr. Hansen has been notified. Mr. Vance is on his way. The car is ready." Alexander arrived looking pale beneath his usual tan, his jaw tight. He didn't say much, simply took the small hospital bag Ms. Albright had prepared and offered Sarah his arm. "Let's go," he said, his voice low and steady. Betraying none of the turmoil Sarah sensed simmering beneath the surface. The ride to the hospital felt simultaneously like an eternity and a blink. Sarah focused on her breathing, trying to manage the escalating contractions. Alexander sat beside her, silent, his hand hovering near hers but not touching, his gaze fixed forward, yet radiating an intense protective energy. At the hospital, the efficiency was almost overwhelming. A private suite, a waiting team of specialists. Alexander's influence was palpable. Dr. Hansen greeted them calmly, her presence reassuring. As the labor progressed, intensifying through the long hours of the night, Alexander surprised everyone, perhaps even himself, by refusing to leave Sarah's side. He stood near her head, a silent, unwavering presence. When a particularly strong contraction racked her body, making her cry out, his hand instinctively found hers, gripping it tightly. It wasn't a calculated gesture. It was pure reflex, a human response to her pain. Sarah clung to his hand, drawing strength from the unexpected solidity of his presence. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He was just there, witnessing her struggle, sharing the intensity of the moment in a way that transcended words or contracts. Finally, after hours that felt like lifetimes, the first sharp, startling cry pierced the air. "It's a boy," Dr. Hansen announced, her voice warm with relief and joy. A tiny, squirming infant was quickly assessed and wrapped. Alexander watched, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes wide with an emotion Sarah had never seen on him before, pure, unadulterated. Oh, but there was no time to dwell. The second baby was imminent. Minutes later, another cry, slightly softer but just as insistent, joined the first. "And a girl," Dr. Hansen declared, her smile widening. "A healthy pair." Exhausted, tears streaming down her face, Sarah watched. As the 2 tiny bundles were gently cleaned, the nurses brought them to her, placing one in each arm. She looked down at their impossibly small faces, their eyes scrunched tight, tiny fingers curling instinctively. A love so fierce, so overwhelming surged through her, erasing everything else, the contract, the fear, the uncertainty. They were here. They were hers, her babies. The thought was both beautiful and agonizing. Alexander stepped closer, hesitantly, reaching out a finger to gently touch the boy's cheek. The baby stirred slightly. Alexander quickly withdrew his hand, as if startled by the contact, by the sheer reality of it. He looked from the babies to Sarah, his expression a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Wonder, fear, a profound vulnerability that stripped away his usual defenses. "They're perfect," he whispered, his voice thick. Sarah met his gaze, seeing, not the ruthless billionaire, but a man utterly undone by the miracle of birth, by the sudden, undeniable weight of fatherhood. In that moment, the sterile contract that had defined their relationship felt like a fragile piece of paper caught in a hurricane. The following days in the hospital were a blur of feeding schedules, diaper changes, and overwhelming exhaustion. mingled with moments of profound joy. Alexander arranged for the best private care, ensuring Sarah and the twins had everything they needed. He visited daily, shedding his corporate armor at the door. He learned awkwardly at first how to hold them, how to swaddle them, his large hands surprisingly gentle. He'd sit for long stretches just watching them sleep, his usual restlessness replaced by a quiet contemplation. He and Sarah spoke little, but the silence was different now, filled with the shared experience of parenthood. They operated as a team, navigating the first chaotic days with the newborns. He saw Sarah's natural maternal grace, her fierce love for the twins, and the quiet sadness that sometimes shadowed her eyes when she looked at them, likely thinking of the impending separation dictated by the contract. The day they were discharged, back to the suburban house felt like stepping into an alternate reality. The nursery was ready, doubled and perfect. Nannies and a night nurse were discreetly available, arranged by Ms. Albright, but Sarah insisted on doing most of the care herself, soaking up every precious moment. Alexander gave her space, but was always nearby, his presence a constant, quiet support. A week after their return, the unspoken deadline loomed. According to the original timeline inferred from the contract, Sarah's role was complete. The final payment was due upon confirmation of the baby's health post-discharge. It was time for her to leave. She spent the morning packing the few belongings she'd accumulated, her movements slow, deliberate. Each tiny onesie folded, each soft blanket smoothed, felt like a tiny heartbreak. She kissed the sleeping twins goodbye, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. She wouldn't let them see her cry. This was for Liam. This was the deal. She walked downstairs, her small bag clutched in her hand, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Alexander was waiting in the foyer, standing by the large front door. He wasn't dressed for business. He wore casual slacks and a soft-knit sweater, looking younger, less imposing, but his eyes held a deep, turbulent storm. "So," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly despite her resolve, "I guess this is it." Alexander didn't move. He just looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. "Is this what you want, Sarah?" he asked quietly. "It's not about what I want," she whispered, the lie bitter on her tongue. "It's the agreement." He took a slow step towards her. "Agreements can be renegotiated. Circumstances change." He reached into the inside pocket of his sweater and pulled out a folded document, a copy of the original surrogacy contract they had both signed months ago, a lifetime ago. He held it up between them. "This," he said, his voice filled with a conviction she'd never heard before, "was based on a flawed premise, a transaction, an error." Then, with a deliberate, decisive movement, he tore the contract in half, then again letting the pieces flutter to the polished floor between them. Sarah gasped, staring at the shredded paper. "Alexander, what are you doing?" "I'm correcting a mistake," he stated firmly, his eyes never leaving hers. "A mistake far greater than the clinic's error. My mistake. Thinking I could control life, control connection, control—" He hesitated, then plunged forward. "Control the way I feel." He closed the remaining distance between them, stopping just inches away. "I don't want you to go, Sarah. These babies, they need their mother. I need you." The admission seemed torn from him, raw and unguarded. "I know I don't deserve your trust. I know I entered this with cold calculation. But these children, watching you with them, watching you, it's changed everything. I don't want an heir managed by nannies in a sterile environment. I want this. Messy, unpredictable, terrifying, real." Sarah felt the tears she'd held back finally break free. "But the contract, Liam's future is secure," Alexander assured her, his voice softening. "Beyond the clinic's settlement, I've established a permanent trust for his ongoing care, anonymously. That is separate. That is done. This," he gestured between them towards the nursery upstairs, "is about us. About them." He gently took her hand, his touch warm, grounding. "Stay, Sarah. Stay, and let's figure out how to be a family. Not based on a contract, but Maybe on something else, something real. Will you give me that chance? She looked into his eyes, seeing the fear mirroring her own, but also seeing a sincerity, a vulnerability, a plea that felt undeniably genuine. The walls she had so carefully maintained crumbled completely. The logic of the contract dissolved in the face of the overwhelming emotion flooding her heart, love for her babies, and a burgeoning hopeful love for the complicated man standing before her. She nodded, unable to speak, tears of relief, fear, and nascent joy streaming down her face. Alexander pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her close, his own relief palpable in the steady beat of his heart against her ear. The pieces of the contract lay forgotten on the floor, symbols of a past transaction replaced by the tentative promise of a shared future. 1 year later, sunlight streamed into the cheerful, brightly decorated living room of the suburban house, now, undeniably, a home. Toys were scattered playfully across a soft rug, where 2 toddlers, a boy with Alexander's dark hair and a girl with Sarah's bright blue eyes, were attempting to stack colorful blocks under the watchful eye of their doting uncle, Liam. Liam, breathing easily now post-transplant, looked healthier and happier than Sarah had ever seen him. Sarah sat on the sofa, sketching in her notebook, a contented smile on her face. She was halfway through her final year of design school, thriving creatively. Alexander entered the room, no longer in a suit, but in casual clothes, a relaxed air about him. He scooped up his daughter, who giggled and reached for his face, then ruffled his son's hair. He sat down beside Sarah, draping an arm comfortably around her shoulders. "Liam's teaching them advanced engineering principles," Alexander joked, nodding towards the teetering block tower. "Looks like it," Sarah laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. Their life wasn't a fairy tale. They were still learning, navigating the complexities of their unconventional beginning, balancing parenthood with their individual goals. There were still moments of insecurity for Sarah, moments where Alexander retreated briefly into his old reserve. But they talked, they worked through it, bound by their love for the twins and the deep, unexpected love that had grown between them. Alexander looked from the children to Sarah, his expression filled with a quiet, profound happiness. "I never thought," he began, his voice soft. "Me neither," Sarah whispered, meeting his gaze. He leaned in and kissed her gently, a kiss filled with warmth, trust, and the promise of many more ordinary, beautiful days to come. The contract was a distant memory. The error had led not to disaster, but to an unforeseen, imperfectly perfect family. Sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the most beautiful miracles. Sarah and Alexander started with a cold contract, born from desperation and a clinical error, but the undeniable power of life and the courage to embrace vulnerability transformed their arrangement into a love story neither could have predicted. Their journey reminds us that families can be built in the most unexpected ways, and that even the most guarded hearts can learn to love when given a second chance. What did you think of Sarah and Alexander's journey? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if it touched your heart, subscribe to the Story channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another story about love, redemption, and the incredible twists of fate. Thanks for watching.